The sun was setting over the endless desert, painting the sky in orange and red. Heat waves rose from the sand, and the wind carried dust across the dry ground. A lone human named Jake walked slowly, his boots heavy with sand, his throat dry from thirst. He had been traveling for days, carrying only a small pack with a half-empty bottle of water and a piece of old bread. Every step felt harder than the last, but he kept moving, searching for shelter before night came. Near a cluster of broken rocks, he stopped. Something had moved there, a shadow too small to be dangerous but too alive to be ignored. Jake narrowed his eyes and stepped closer. At first, he thought it was just an animal, but then he saw the strange blue stripes glowing faintly in the fading light. It was a cub, an alien cub, small, thin, and trembling with weakness. Its large eyes were wide with fear, glowing softly in the dusk. Its fur was rough and dirty, and its ribs showed through its fragile body. The cub gave a weak growl, trying to appear brave, but its voice cracked like a whisper. Jake crouched low, keeping his hands open so the little creature would not feel threatened. He studied it carefully. Its legs shook with hunger, its breathing shallow. He could see it had not eaten for days. Jake reached into his pack and pulled out his last piece of bread. His own stomach ached with hunger, but when he looked at the cub, he could not turn away. He broke the bread in half and placed it on the sand, pushing it closer. The cub sniffed the air, its ears twitching, but it did not move. Fear kept it frozen. Slowly, Jake took a sip of water from his bottle and then set the bread down right in front of the cub. He stepped back and sat on a rock. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cub's eyes flickered between the bread and Jake. Then its stomach growled loudly, echoing in the silence of the desert. At last, the cub crawled forward, sniffed the bread again, and took a shaky bite. Jake watched as it chewed, crumbs falling onto the sand. The cub devoured the bread quickly, desperation stronger than its fear. When the food was gone, it licked the ground as if searching for more. Jake sighed and pulled out the second half. He tossed it gently toward the cub, and this time the little one grabbed it without hesitation. For the first time, Jake smiled. He had not seen another living being in weeks, and this fragile creature looked at him not like an enemy, but as a chance to live. After finishing the bread, the cub crawled closer, its glowing eyes softer now, less afraid. It curled up a few feet away from him, still wary but no longer running. Jake leaned back against the rock, watching the stars beginning to appear in the sky. Night in the desert was dangerous. The air grew cold, the sand whispered with movement, and predators came out from their hiding places. Jake built a small fire from dry branches he had collected earlier. The cub's ears twitched at the crackle of the flames, but instead of running, it moved nearer, drawn by the warmth. Jake poured a little water into the cap of his bottle and slid it toward the cub. The creature hesitated, then lapped it up quickly, drops dripping down its small chin. When it finished, it looked up at him with wide eyes, almost questioning. The silence of the night pressed around them. Then, out of nowhere, a sound cut through the desert. A low, deep roar rolled across the sands, powerful and wild. Jake froze. His eyes darted to the cub, who suddenly stiffened, its ears rising high. The cub made a soft, trembling sound in response, as if answering the call. Jake's heart pounded. That roar was no ordinary animal. It was strong, commanding, and close. He gripped the handle of his small knife, the only weapon he carried. He knew that whatever made that sound was coming. The cub stood on shaky legs and looked toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Its tail twitched nervously, but there was no fear in its gaze, only recognition. Jake realized the cub was not alone. It had a family. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of something wild and powerful. The fire crackled louder, and shadows stretched across the rocks. Jake could feel eyes on him, unseen but sharp, watching from the night. The cub took a few steps away from the fire, its glowing stripes brighter in the dark, as if guiding someone toward them. Jake's grip tightened on his knife. He knew he should run, but his legs felt heavy. The desert was endless, and whatever was out there would find him anyway. The roar came again, closer this time, shaking the ground under his boots. The cub made another soft cry, calling back. Jake's chest tightened. He had fed the cub, saved it from hunger, but in doing so, he had summoned something else. From the blackness beyond the rocks, two golden eyes appeared, burning like fire in the dark. They were too high above the ground to belong to another cub. The shape behind them was massive, tall, and broad, moving slowly into the glow of the fire. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The cub rushed forward, standing between Jake and the shadow. Its small voice rose in a weak but determined sound. Jake realized the truth. This was not just an animal he had helped. This was a child, and now its mother had come. The figure stepped closer, claws glinting in the firelight, muscles rippling under striped blue skin. A tigress-like alien, taller than any human, stood there, her gaze fierce and unblinking. She looked first at her cub, then at Jake. The desert fell silent. Jake did not move. The cub's mother let out a low growl, deep and threatening, shaking the air between them. Jake knew one thing. His act of kindness had just invited something far more dangerous into his life. The night was cold, and the desert wind carried fine sand that scratched against Jake's skin. The fire burned low, its glow fighting against the darkness. The cub stood close to Jake, but its glowing eyes kept glancing at the tall figure now stepping into the circle of light. The tigress mother was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Her body was strong, covered in sleek blue fur with black stripes that rippled as she moved. Muscles shifted under her skin with every step. Her claws clicked against the rocks, sharp and heavy, and her golden eyes locked onto Jake as if he were prey. She growled, the sound so deep it made the ground vibrate. Jake's heart hammered in his chest. He slowly raised his hands to show he carried no weapon, though his knife rested by his side. The tigress bared her teeth, her fangs shining in the firelight. She took one step forward, then another, circling him. Jake could feel her gaze cutting through him like blades. The cub cried out and ran to her. It pressed itself against her leg, purring weakly. The mother's growl softened, but her eyes never left Jake. She bent low, sniffing the cub, licking its head gently, then glared at Jake again. She could smell his scent on her cub, smell the bread and water he had given. To her, it was not kindness. It was intrusion. Jake swallowed hard, keeping his hands up. "I mean no harm," he whispered, his voice shaking. Of course, she might not understand his words, but tone mattered. He tried to look calm, though fear gripped every muscle in his body. The tigress let out a roar that split the night. It was not only anger, it was warning. The desert echoed with the sound, and Jake knew that any creature within miles had heard it. His ears rang as silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The cub looked between them, its little chest rising and falling fast. Then, to Jake's shock, it stepped forward, standing in front of him, its tiny body shielding him from its mother's massive claws. It growled, a weak, broken sound, but it was still a defense. The tigress froze, her golden eyes flickering with confusion. Her cub, her blood, was protecting a human? For a moment, the air itself seemed to stop moving. The tigress tilted her head, her growl fading into a low rumble of thought. She sniffed the air again, her sharp nose catching Jake's sweat, blood, and fear, but no aggression. The cub rubbed against Jake's leg, purring again. Jake's breath came out shaky. He could not believe it. The little one was defending him. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body stayed rooted in place. He felt the cub's tiny warmth against his side, and his fear twisted into something strange, responsibility. The tigress crouched low, her long tail sweeping the sand. She was ready to strike if she sensed even the smallest threat. Her claws flexed, cutting deep lines into the ground, but she did not attack. Instead, she began to circle Jake again, slow and careful, like a predator studying something new. Her gaze burned into him, questioning, searching. Then, in a voice rough but shaped into human words, she hissed, "Why? Feed, cub?" The sound startled Jake. Her voice was harsh, broken, like she had only learned scraps of his language. But she spoke. Jake's mouth was dry, but he managed to answer. "Hungry," he said softly. It was hungry. The tigress tilted her head again, her ears twitching. Her eyes narrowed, but her body stopped tensing for attack. She looked at her cub once more, then at Jake. She could not understand why the cub defended this man. Her kind had always told stories of humans, weak, fragile, not to be trusted. And yet, her cub stood there, eyes glowing with loyalty. The fire snapped, sending sparks into the night. The tigress turned her head quickly at the sound, her instincts sharp, ready for danger. And then, as if to answer her suspicion, footsteps echoed in the distance. Not just one set, many. Heavy boots and the metallic click of weapons. Jake stiffened. He knew the sound of soldiers, or hunters. The tigress growled, her ears flattening. She pulled her cub close with her tail, her eyes scanning the dark. From the shadows, figures began to appear. Alien raiders carrying blades and plasma rifles, their armor catching the firelight. They spread out, surrounding Jake and the Tigress. Their leader, tall with a scar across his face, sneered at the sight. "Well, well," he said in his own tongue, though Jake could guess his meaning. His eyes lingered on the Tigress. The queen herself, and a human. How strange. Jake gripped his knife, though it felt useless against so many. The Tigress bared her teeth, her growl louder than before. Her golden eyes burned with rage, but even she looked outnumbered. The raiders laughed, raising their weapons. One pointed at Jake. Another reached toward the cub. The Tigress snarled, her claws flashing, ready to tear them apart. The cub cried out in fear, pressing itself against Jake's leg again. Jake's body shook, but his grip on the knife tightened. He knew he was just a man against monsters. But leaving the cub, or its mother, to die was not an option. His jaw clenched. He would fight, even if it killed him. The raider leader lifted his weapon, aiming at Jake's chest. In that frozen moment, Jake met the Tigress's eyes. For the first time, they held not only suspicion, but something else. Choice. Would she see him as prey, or as an ally? The fire popped again, loud like a gunshot, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. The Tigress let out a roar that shook the raiders where they stood, her claws digging into the ground as her body crouched to strike. Jake's knife gleamed faintly in the firelight, his hand steady despite the fear. Surrounded, outnumbered, man and beast stood side by side. And in that dangerous silence, before the first move was made, Jake realized the night would decide everything. His fate, the cub's life, and whether the Tigress would remain his enemy or become his only hope. The circle of raiders tightened, their armor glinting faintly under the moonlight. Their weapons hummed with energy, aimed directly at Jake and the Tigress. The cub whimpered, its small body pressing against Jake's leg as if he could shield it from danger. The Tigress queen stood tall, her claws flexing, her muscles tense, her golden eyes filled with fury. The leader of the raiders stepped forward, sneering as his shadow fell across the firelight. He was a scarred brute, his face cut by old battles, his eyes cold and cruel. He pointed his rifle at Jake. "Strange," he said in his rough tongue, a translator device buzzing at his collar, turning his words into broken human speech. "A human, standing with her. You must have a death wish." Jake didn't move. His knife was tiny compared to their weapons, but his grip didn't shake. His mind screamed that this was hopeless, but something deeper kept him rooted. He had fed the cub. He had seen it smile at him. He could not abandon it now. The Tigress growled, low and dangerous, a warning that made the raiders pause. Her voice rolled like thunder, powerful even in broken human words. "He fed my cub." The raiders laughed cruelly. "Fed it? He will be food himself." The leader aimed at Jake again, ready to fire. But before he could pull the trigger, the cub stepped forward, baring its tiny fangs, its body trembling but brave. It gave a weak growl, placing itself between Jake and the guns. The sight made the raiders laugh harder. Yet the Tigress queen froze, her eyes wide with something no one expected: hesitation. Her cub was protecting the human again. Against warriors, against death, it chose Jake. The Tigress straightened to her full height, towering over them all. Her claws glowed in the firelight as she spread them wide. "Enough," she commanded in her own tongue, her voice shaking the sand. Some raiders faltered. None dared step closer. The Queen of the Wilds was feared across the desert, a warrior who had slain countless foes. But one of the younger raiders scoffed and aimed at Jake anyway. His finger touched the trigger. Jake didn't think. He lunged, grabbing a burning branch from the fire. The wood seared his palm, but he swung it hard, the flames whipping across the young raider's face. The raider screamed, stumbling back, dropping his weapon. The other raiders shouted, their formation breaking. The Tigress roared, a sound so violent it cracked the air. She leaped forward, her claws tearing through two warriors in a flash of blue and blood. The fight had begun. Jake ducked as plasma bolts seared the night. He grabbed the cub and rolled behind a rock, shielding it with his body. Sand exploded around him as shots hit the ground. He peeked out and saw the Tigress moving like a storm. She was a blur of muscle and rage, ripping weapons apart, throwing raiders into the sand. Her roar echoed over and over, a sound of fury and protection. But there were too many enemies. For every raider she struck down, two more took aim. Plasma fire burned across her fur, cutting lines of smoke and pain. She fought on, but even a queen had limits. Jake's chest tightened. She was powerful, but she could not win alone. He had to do something. He spotted the weapon dropped by the raider he had burned. Heart pounding? He sprinted out from cover, grabbed the rifle, and turned it in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, humming with energy. A raider noticed him and charged. Jake barely managed to pull the trigger. The blast knocked the raider back, smoke rising from his armor. Jake's arms shook, but he didn't stop. He fired again, forcing two more to retreat. The Tigress saw him. Their eyes met in the chaos, hers blazing gold, his steady with determination. She snarled not at him, but at the raiders, her fury now doubled. The leader shouted for his men to regroup. Kill the human! Break the queen! The raiders pressed harder, but Jake fought with desperate strength, every blast buying a second more of survival. The cub clung to the rock, watching him with wide, glowing eyes. At last, the Tigress slashed down the leader's weapon, tearing it apart in a spray of sparks. She pressed her claws to his throat, her voice a growl. Leave! The surviving raiders, seeing their leader pinned, hesitated. Fear spread among them. Slowly, one by one, they backed away, dragging their wounded with them. The desert fell quiet again, the only sound the crackle of the dying fire. The Tigress released the leader, shoving him into the sand. He scrambled up and fled into the darkness, his men following. Breathing heavy, blood dripping from her wounds, the Tigress turned back toward Jake. He still held the smoking rifle, his chest heaving. The cub ran to him, pressing against his chest, purring weakly. The Tigress's gaze lingered on him, sharp but unreadable. She could not ignore what she had seen. A human had fought raiders, risked his life, saved her cub twice. She stepped closer, towering over him. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Why? Jake's throat was dry, but he answered with simple words. Because your cub laughed, reminded me of family. Her golden eyes softened just for a moment. She looked at her cub nestled against Jake, then back at him. For the first time, she did not see weakness. She saw something else, courage. The night was still dangerous. More raiders could return. The Tigress scanned the horizon, then looked at Jake again. Come, she said, her voice rough but commanding. Jake hesitated, his body aching, but when the cub tugged at his sleeve, he nodded. He followed the Tigress queen into the dark desert, guided by her glowing stripes. The fire died behind them, and the silence of the night returned. For Jake, one truth settled in his heart. This was no longer just survival. Something bigger had begun, something he could not yet understand. And it had all started with a starving cub and a single piece of bread. The desert stretched for miles, but the Tigress queen moved like she knew every grain of sand. Her glowing stripes shimmered under the moonlight, and her long tail swayed like a weapon ready to strike. Jake followed her, his steps heavy and slow, his body aching from exhaustion. The cub padded happily between them, its small paws leaving prints beside his boots. Every now and then it looked up at Jake and purred, as if nothing had happened, as if raiders and death had not almost taken them all. But Jake knew the danger was far from over. His hands still shook from the fight, the memory of plasma bolts burning into the sand too close to his head. He had never faced so many enemies at once. Only luck and the Tigress's fury had saved them. Yet the quiet around them was uneasy. The night was too still, too empty. They reached a line of jagged rocks, tall enough to hide in. The Tigress stopped and sniffed the air. Her ears twitched, her eyes narrowing. Jake tensed, gripping the stolen rifle tighter. The cub tilted its head, confused, but the Tigress growled softly, warning them both. Without speaking, she pushed them into the cover of the rocks. Jake crouched low, his heart pounding, trying to stay silent. The Tigress's golden eyes glowed in the dark as she scanned the horizon. Jake followed her gaze and then saw it, shadows moving, dozens of them. Raiders again. They were not just hunting. They were tracking. Torches flickered in the distance and weapons gleamed. Jake's stomach twisted. They would not stop until they had the Tigress queen's head, and maybe his too. The Tigress crouched low, whispering in her rough human tongue, "Ambush!" Jake's breath caught. "How many?" he asked. Her ears twitched again. "Too many." The cub whimpered, pressing close to Jake. He ran his hand gently over its head, trying to calm it, though his own fear was rising like fire in his chest. The Tigress leaned closer, her voice a sharp whisper. "If they find us, you run. Take cub. Do not stop." Jake stared at her, shocked. And you? Her golden eyes burned. I fight. Before Jake could argue, the raider's footsteps grew louder. Shouts carried on the wind. The queen's body tensed, her claws digging into the stone. Then, without warning, plasma fire lit up the night. Bolts smashed against the rocks, sparks exploding around them. Jake ducked, pulling the cub into his arms. The tigress leapt out with a roar so fierce it shook the raiders to their core. She slammed into their front line, claws ripping weapons apart, her tail whipping like a blade. Screams filled the air as she tore through them, her body glowing with rage. Jake peeked out from cover, firing the rifle clumsily but managing to drop one raider. His arms ached from the recoil, but he refused to stop. He could not let the tigress fight alone. The cub cried in his arms, terrified, but Jake held it tight with one arm and kept firing with the other. The battle was chaos. Sand erupted under plasma blasts, rocks shattered, and smoke filled the air. The tigress fought like a storm, but for every raider she cut down, more appeared. Their leader from before was not among them. This was a new warband, larger and more dangerous. A plasma bolt grazed Jake's shoulder, burning his skin. He screamed, but forced himself to keep moving. He dragged the cub behind a larger rock, shielding it. His vision blurred, but he saw the tigress surrounded, raiders circling her with blades and rifles. Jake's mind raced. She was powerful, but even she could not fight forever. He looked down at the cub. Its glowing eyes were filled with tears. "Stay here," Jake whispered, though his voice was broken with pain. He grabbed the rifle, stood, and ran toward the fight. The tigress was on her knees, wounds smoking, her breath heavy. She slashed one raider down, but stumbled as another raised his weapon to strike her from behind. Jake roared, charging forward. He slammed the butt of the rifle into the raider's head, knocking him to the ground. The tigress turned, shocked to see the human fighting beside her. He was bleeding, weak, but his eyes burned with the same fire as hers. Together they fought, man and beast side by side. Jake fired wildly, forcing the raiders back, while the tigress tore through their lines with claw and fang. Blood painted the sand, and the night echoed with death cries. But the ambush was relentless. More shadows kept coming, more weapons flashing. The tigress hissed in pain, stumbling, her body trembling from wounds. Jake grabbed her arm, holding her up. "Don't stop!" he shouted over the chaos. "We can't stop!" Her golden eyes met his, wide with disbelief. No human had ever fought like this for her kind. No human had ever stood at her side. For the first time, she felt something strange, trust. The last raider fell with a cry as the tigress ripped through him, her claws glowing with blood. Silence followed, heavy and broken only by the crackle of burning weapons. Jake dropped to his knees, gasping for air, the rifle falling from his hands. The tigress swayed, her body marked with wounds, her breath ragged. The cub ran to them, crying out, pressing its head against Jake's chest, then against its mother's leg. The tigress knelt slowly, one massive claw resting on Jake's shoulder. She looked at him long and hard, her golden eyes filled with something new. Not just suspicion, not just gratitude, something deeper. Her voice was low, almost trembling. "Why? Still fight?" Jake, exhausted, bloody, and weak, managed a faint smile. "Because I'm human. And humans don't walk away." The tigress stared at him, her heart heavy. She had always believed humans were weak. Tonight, she saw a truth her people would never accept. Humans were dangerous, not because of their strength, but because of their refusal to give up. She looked at the cub pressed against Jake's chest, safe and alive, then at Jake himself, half dead but still breathing. A thought formed in her mind, a dangerous thought. Perhaps this human was not prey. Perhaps he was something more. The cave was cold and damp, hidden deep inside a wall of jagged cliffs. Jake lay on a bed of dry grass, his body aching from burns and cuts. His shoulder throbbed where the plasma bolt had grazed him, and his arms were heavy from holding the rifle too long. He struggled to keep his eyes open, but exhaustion pulled at him like chains. Beside him, the cub curled up against his chest, purring softly, as if its small body could shield him from the pain. The tigress queen sat near the cave's entrance, her golden eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. She was silent, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Blood streaked her fur, her body lined with fresh wounds, yet her posture was still proud, still powerful. Jake stirred, wincing as he tried to sit up. The tigress turned her head quickly, her gaze sharp. "Stay," she commanded in her rough voice. Her words were broken, but her tone was clear. "You are hurt." Jake gave a faint laugh, though it sounded more like a cough. "You too," he whispered, nodding at the deep cuts along her side. Her fur was burned in places, her claws still red with dried blood. She did not answer, only lowered her head to lick one of her wounds. After a long silence, she rose and came closer. She crouched beside him, her large frame casting a shadow across the cave wall. Jake tensed as her massive claw reached for him, but instead of striking, she pressed gently against his shoulder. He hissed in pain as she touched the burn, her golden eyes narrowed. "Stupid human," she muttered. "Why fight raiders? Not your battle." Jake's breathing was heavy. He looked at the cub, sleeping soundly against him. His voice was weak, but his words carried weight. "Because it laughed, reminded me of my sister, long ago." The tigress tilted her head, her ears twitching. She stared at him, confused. She had expected excuses, fear, maybe even lies. But instead, his words were simple, honest, and full of something rare: memory. She sat back, watching him closely. "You risk death. For cub, not yours." "Foolish." Jake smiled faintly. "Maybe. But someone had to." The cub stirred in its sleep, pressing closer to Jake. Its soft purr echoed faintly in the cave, and the tigress felt a strange heaviness in her chest. Her cub trusted this human completely, a trust that had been earned with bread, water, and blood. She stood suddenly and walked to the cave's mouth, staring out into the endless desert night. Her voice was low, more to herself than to him. "Humans, weak," they said, "fragile, not worth saving. Yet you stand when others fall." Jake leaned back against the wall, his eyes half closing. "Maybe we're both foolish," he murmured, "but we don't give up. Not when it matters." The tigress looked back at him, her golden eyes catching the firelight. She studied the cuts on his face, the burns on his arms, the way his body trembled but still tried to sit upright. She had fought countless warriors, faced death 100 times, but no sight had unsettled her like this. One fragile human refusing to break. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound outside. The crunch of sand, faint but sharp. She froze, ears flicking, muscles tightening. Jake noticed the change in her posture immediately. He reached for the rifle lying by his side. The tigress growled low, holding up her claw to silence him. She crept to the entrance, her body tense. Jake waited, heart pounding, the cub now awake and clinging to his shirt. Voices drifted in, harsh and guttural. The raiders again. They had followed their trail. Shadows moved just beyond the rocks, torches flickering. Jake gripped the rifle, though his arms trembled with weakness. He looked at the tigress, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't fight them all." The tigress's claws scraped against the stone as she crouched low. Her eyes burned with rage. "We fight, together." The cub let out a frightened cry, burying its face against Jake. He held it tight with one arm, the rifle steady in the other. The tigress glanced at him once more. Something unspoken passed between them. An agreement, a bond forged not by choice, but by survival. The first raider stepped into view, his weapon raised. The tigress pounced before he could fire, slamming him into the sand with a roar that shook the cave. More raiders surged forward, shouting, weapons blazing. Plasma bolts tore into the rocks, sparks flying. Jake fired back, forcing two to fall. His shoulder screamed with pain, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to stop. The cub cried out, clinging to him tighter, but he kept firing, each shot fueled by sheer will. The tigress was a storm of claws and fury, tearing through the attackers. But she was slowing, her body wounded and bleeding. Jake saw one raider raise his weapon behind her. Without thinking, he threw himself forward, tackling the raider with his bare hands. The two struggled in the sand, Jake wrestling for control. The raider was stronger, heavier, but Jake's desperation gave him strength. With a roar of his own, he slammed the weapon aside and drove the butt of the rifle into the raider's face. The tigress turned just in time to see Jake standing over the fallen enemy, blood running down his arm, his chest heaving. Her golden eyes widened. She tore through the last of the raiders, her roars echoing across the night until silence fell once again. Jake collapsed to his knees, gasping. The cub rushed to him, crying, rubbing its small head against his face. He held it close, though his arms were weak. The tigress approached slowly, her body trembling, her wounds deep. She placed one massive claw against his chest, feeling the pounding of his heart. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Human, why risk all?" Jake looked up at her, sweat and blood dripping down his face. His answer was simple, quiet, but it struck her like a blade. Because no one else would. For a long moment, the Queen of the Wild said nothing. She only stared at him, her golden eyes filled with conflict. Then, without another word, she lowered herself beside him, her body shielding both him and the cub from the cold night. The cave was silent except for their breathing. But inside her heart, something new had begun to grow, something more dangerous than claws or fire, something that would change everything. The sun rose slowly over the desert, its light creeping into the cave and washing the stone walls in pale gold. Jake opened his eyes with a groan, his body stiff and sore. Every muscle burned, every cut stung. He tried to push himself up, but the cub was still curled against his chest, sleeping soundly. Its small purrs vibrated softly, like a heartbeat. At the cave's entrance, the Tigress Queen stood tall, her back to him, her stripes glowing faintly in the morning light. She had not slept. Her ears twitched at every sound. Her claws rested lightly against the rock, ready to strike at anything that approached. Even wounded, she looked powerful, untamed, untouchable. Jake sat up slowly, careful not to wake the cub. His eyes lingered on her. There was something about the way she stood, the way her shoulders carried the weight of survival and leadership. She was not only a mother, she was a queen. She turned suddenly, her golden eyes catching his. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she walked back inside, crouching low beside him. Her voice was rough, yet softer than before. "You fight like one of us." Jake gave a weak smile. "One of you? I thought I was prey." Her lips curled, almost like a smirk, though her fangs made it sharp. Perhaps not. Before Jake could answer, a noise echoed outside the cave, footsteps, heavy and many. The tigress's ears shot up, her body tense. Jake grabbed the rifle lying nearby, though his arms shook as he lifted it. The cub woke, sensing danger, and pressed against him nervously. The tigress growled low. "Not raiders, my clan." Jake blinked. Her clan. The thought made his stomach twist. What would they do if they found him with her and the cub? Moments later, shadows filled the entrance. Tall tigress warriors stepped in, their armor gleaming, their claws sharp. Their eyes widened when they saw the scene, the queen, the cub, and a human beside them. Murmurs filled the cave, suspicion and anger rising. One warrior pointed at Jake, his voice harsh. "Why is he here? He should be dead." The tigress queen stood, her massive frame towering over them. She raised her claw for silence. "He saved the cub. He saved me." The warriors looked at each other, disbelief plain in their faces. Another spat on the ground. "A human? Impossible. They are weak." Jake's hand tightened on the rifle, but the tigress glanced back at him, her golden eyes steady, commanding him to stay calm. Then she stepped forward, her voice louder. "He fought raiders. He bled for my cub. He is no prey." The cave fell silent. The warriors shifted uncomfortably, but one stepped forward, tall and scarred, clearly a rival. His eyes narrowed. "If he is no prey, let him prove it. Trial of the wilds. If he lives, we accept. If he dies, he was nothing." Jake's chest tightened. He understood enough. Trial, a test. He looked at the tigress queen, but her face gave nothing away. She stared at him for a long moment, then spoke low so only he could hear. "They will never believe words. You must show." Jake's mouth went dry, but he nodded. He had no choice. That evening, the warriors led him and the tigress queen into a vast jungle at the edge of the desert. The trees stretched high, their twisted branches blocking the sun. Strange sounds echoed through the shadows, growls, hisses, the flutter of wings. The air was thick, heavy, and alive with danger. The trial began. Jake was given nothing but a small blade, far too small for comfort. The warriors watched from a distance, waiting for him to fail. The tigress queen stayed close, though not close enough to fight for him. This was his test. The first predator came quickly, a beast with 6 legs and a mouth full of needle teeth. It leapt at Jake, faster than he could think. He stumbled, rolling to the ground, barely dodging its strike. His heart pounded, fear clawing at his throat. But then instinct kicked in. He grabbed a rock, slamming it against the creature's skull. The beast screeched, thrashing wildly, but Jake held on, driving the blade into its neck. Blood sprayed across his face as it fell still. The warriors muttered in surprise. They had expected him to die in seconds. Jake stood, panting, his hands shaking, but his eyes steady. He looked at the tigress queen. She watched him silently, her expression unreadable. But deep inside, her chest swelled with something unfamiliar, pride. The night grew darker, and more beasts came. Jake used traps, rocks, and fire, anything he could think of. He was not the strongest, not the fastest, but he was clever. He used the jungle itself as a weapon. Slowly, painfully, he survived each challenge. By dawn, he stumbled back into the clearing, bloodied and bruised, but alive. The warriors stared at him in silence, their disbelief turning to reluctant respect. The rival warrior hissed in anger. He cheated death, but he is still human. He will break. The Tigress Queen stepped forward, her golden eyes blazing. He did not break. He endured. That is strength. Her clan lowered their heads, unwilling to argue with her voice of command. The cub rushed to Jake, wrapping its small arms around his neck. Jake laughed weakly, holding it close. The tigress watched the scene, her heart heavy with realization. Against every law of her people, against everything she had believed, this human had proven himself. He was not prey, he was kin. And she knew from this day, protecting him would mean defying the very world she ruled. The jungle was quiet after the trial, but peace did not last long. News of Jake's survival spread quickly across the desert. The raiders, humiliated twice, gathered in greater numbers, swearing to take the Tigress Queen's head and burn her clan. Scouts brought word of their army moving fast, carrying fire and steel. The Tigress Queen stood on a cliff, her golden eyes fixed on the horizon where smoke already curled into the sky. Behind her, warriors shifted nervously, claws scraping against stone. They had fought many battles, but never against a force this large. Fear ran through the ranks like poison. Jake stood among them, his body still aching from the trial, but his spirit unbroken. He held no great weapon, no armor, only his stubborn will. The cub sat on his shoulder, its glowing eyes full of worry. Jake looked at the queen, his voice steady. "We can't run. They'll chase us forever." The queen turned her gaze on him, her jaw tight. "If we stay, many die." Jake shook his head. "If we run, all die." Her eyes burned into his, and for the first time, she saw no fear there, only resolve. It unsettled her, but also gave her strength. She lifted her head high, roaring so loudly the ground shook. Her warriors straightened, their fear tempered by her voice. The battle came at dawn. The raiders poured into the valley like a swarm of locusts, their banners snapping in the wind, their weapons glowing with fire. The Tigress Queen stood at the front, her clan behind her, and at her side, Jake, a lone human with nothing but a stolen rifle and courage that refused to die. The clash was brutal. Plasma bolts streaked across the sky, burning trees and shattering stone. The Tigress Queen tore through enemy lines, her claws flashing, her roars shaking the valley. Her warriors followed with fury, ripping raiders apart in a storm of teeth and steel. Jake moved differently. He was not as fast, not as strong, but he was clever. He set traps with vines, led enemies into pits, used fire to scatter their ranks. Every shot from his rifle counted, every move meant to keep the queen and cub alive. At one point, the queen was surrounded, raiders closing in from all sides. A plasma bolt burned across her shoulder, and she staggered, blood staining her fur. She roared in defiance, but her legs trembled. The raider leader raised his weapon to finish her. Jake charged. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He dropped his rifle, ran through the smoke, and threw himself into the line of fire. He grabbed the queen's arm, pulling her back, and with strength he did not know he had, he carried her out of the circle. Plasma scorched the ground where she had stood a second before. The warriors who saw it froze in disbelief. A human, smaller and weaker, had carried their queen as if she were not a beast of war, but something worth saving at any cost. The raider leader snarled in fury, shouting orders, but the moment had already changed everything. The queen rose again, blood dripping, her golden eyes blazing brighter than fire. She roared so loudly that the raiders faltered, their courage breaking. Her warriors surged forward with renewed strength, tearing through the enemy ranks with unstoppable rage. The battle raged until the valley was littered with broken weapons and fallen bodies. At last, the raiders fled, their leader retreating into the smoke, his army shattered. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of fire and the cries of the wounded. Jake collapsed to his knees, the rifle slipping from his hands. His chest heaved, his body shaking, but he was alive. The cub ran to him, climbing into his arms, pressing its head against his face. Jake held it tight, his eyes closing in relief. The Tigress Queen approached, limping, her body covered in blood and scars. She stood over him, her shadow long against the broken earth. Her warriors gathered behind her, waiting for her judgment. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she bent low until her golden eyes were level with his. Her massive claw touched his chest, feeling the pounding of his heart. Her voice was low, but it carried across the valley. From this day, no law calls human weak. From this day, he is kin. Her warriors lowered their heads, their disbelief giving way to silence. The cub purred loudly, almost in triumph, clinging to Jake as if the words were already true. Jake looked up at her, too tired to speak, but his faint smile was enough. The queen straightened, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. For the first time, she did not stand alone. She had her cub, her clan, and now, a human who had changed everything. That night, as the fires of battle died and stars filled the sky, Jake sat beside the queen, the cub curled against him. The desert wind was cold, but he felt warmth he had not known in years. Kindness to a starving cub had brought him to this moment. And now, because of that choice, two worlds had begun to change.